Okay, well, thanks for the opportunity to speak about the history of Plettenberg Bay. My background is in book publishing. I was born and grew up in Cape Town, spent about 50 years in Cape Town prior to coming to Plettenberg Bay. And most of my career has been dedicated to editing and preparing books for publication. Firstly with Longman Group and later with David Phillip, and I've been on my own since 1990 as a media and development consultant and book producer. When I first came to Plet, I got involved, I should say 13 years ago, I got involved with the local history society, the Van Plettenberg History Society. And they did a remarkable service over 30 years in providing 6 talks a year, every second month, involving not only the history of Plettenberg Bay, but also further afield. I myself gave a talk once, for example, on the history of the Holy Grail. So they do tend to go quite widely, but I would say about 50% of the talks over 30 years were focused on families and developments in Plettenberg Bay. So what I did is I started archiving that material and also reducing it from reported bulletins to single files with proper sourcing and of name and date and everything. And after 6 months of doing that, I started to see a pattern developing in the history of Plettenberg Bay. More accurately, the history of Bitu municipality, because Plettenberg Bay, for those of you who don't know, is a small resort town on the southern Cape Coast with little satellite villages around it, probably about 6 villages which are entirely autonomous, but which all fall under the Bitu municipality. So when one studies the history of Bitu, one also looks at the history, for example, of the outlying areas of Wittedrif, Kranshoek, Kurland, Kwanakotula, New Horizons, and so forth. So to focus on the whole area, you need to start, I suppose, in geological time and look at the Robberg Peninsula, which is a unique geological formation, which appeared about 150,000 years ago, with a series of caves that stretch all along the southern Cape Coast. And Robberg Cave was first worked about 1920s, a place called Nelson's Bay that's just inside the Robberg Reserve on the peninsula. And this little site has been quite nicely developed with a display area and everything. So you can read in the display the fortunes of those people that lived in those caves for about 100,000 years, on and off. They came back. And one of the reasons why they came in and out was because of global climate conditions, where, for example, in the Ice Age, 14,500 years ago, the ice caps were so big in the northern and southern parts that the sea went back about 250 kilometers. And there were grasslands outside Robberg, and people used to go and hunt there. And the Robberg Cave was their lookout post and their place for sleeping. And then as time went on, these original people later were superseded, if you like, by northern migrants, the so-called Khwekwe'in. It used to be known as Hottentots, but the true name is Khwekwe'in. They migrated down and with their cattle and their sheep and started occupying seasonal occupation of grazing lands on what had become the plateaus that we know today, particularly Mossel Bay, Riversdale and all those areas. So much so that when the first Portuguese explorers came past, namely Bartolomé Dias in 1488 and later, they looked up on these plateaus above Mossel Bay, more or less where Pinnacle Point and Casino is now, and they saw so many cows on those plains that they named it Bay of Aquerosh, or the Bay of Cowboys. And so it went on for a good 100, maybe 500 years or more, until such time as the first Dutch settlers settled in Cape Town in 1652 under the auspices of the Dutch East India Company, the first multinational in the world, spanning a number of continents, including Batavia, which was their main trading area. And Cape Town was only ever meant to be a refreshment station. But because of their requirement for fresh meat, for example, they started trading first with the local Goring-Hakwa people in the southwestern Cape, but later their needs shifted further along the coast, meeting up in Riversdale, Albertina, Mossel Bay, the area closest to us, with the people, the Hesekwa. And as time wore on, the indigenous people, as they then were dispossessed not only of their cattle by way of trading, but also of their land. Because as the colony expanded in the direction of Plettenberg Bay, the indigenous people were displaced and were reduced, as it were, to farm laborers and other kinds of dispossessed people. And the border was extended beyond Swellendam, and part of that exploitation of the local environment and its people was the heavy exploitation of the forests, until they got to George and discovered the Caimans River, which is a very deep ravine, very difficult to cross. So the forest station stopped at what is now George East. And in about 1770, it was decided to send a party from that station to the Bitu area under one Johan Meerding. 14 people came across, mostly Dutch-speaking, although some of German origin, and settled along the Pisang River Valley on one side of Plettenberg Bay, modern Plettenberg Bay, and also in the Witterdrift, Pieter River Valley. And two prominent families came to the fore during that period, between 1770 and the 1800s, and that was the Van Huisteen family in Witterdrift and the Van Rooyen family in Pisang Valley. They were the two most powerful families in the area. And as time wore on, they prospered and their farms expanded. Children were born and given other farms. And another family that came to the fore was the Reed family in Kerboomstrand. And they carried on for a good few years, but slowly the Dutch Navy was overwhelmed by the British Navy, especially during the Napoleonic era at the beginning of the 19th century, so that the Dutch were displaced as the masters of Southern Africa, and the English colonists took over, finally taking their final occupation in 1815 under Lord Charles Somerset. But prior to that, there'd already been skirmishes in this part of town in 1770 when Van Plettenberg put his border post in the top hill of Plettenberg Bay overlooking Central Beach. He put a border marker there and proclaimed it part of the colony. But at the same time, some of the Khwekhwen people had been trained in battle, and some of them were settled in the Sundays River area and formed an alliance with the local Xhosa-speaking tribe called the Amagunukwebe. And the Amagunukwebe were a mixture of people of African language origin and people of Khwekhwen origin, and they were living on the border, modern border if you like, around the Sunday River in the Port Elizabeth, East London area, and formed an alliance with the Khwekhwen people who were disaffected from the British colonial rulers, more particularly two brothers, Stuurman brothers. David was the leader. And they then broke out of their confines there and formed a base camp in the Baffiehandskloof. And from there they raided the whole of the Garden Route as far as Knysna and Mossel Bay. And during one of their assaults on the area, they caught a Cape farming party who were on their way to retreat back to Cape Town and murdered a couple of them. And then one of the guys dressed up in one of the women's clothing and toddled over to Witterdrift, where they'd put up a fort, which was witnessed by Thunberg in 1802. And when they saw this guy dressed in their neighbor's clothing, they promptly killed him and then formed a commando and tracked the rest of the guys down, and they fought a battle and defeated this particular band. But the fighting along the border area was so intense that the British Army, when they finally came to rest in South Africa, they pushed the people back, all of them, over the Fish River and declared that area on this side of the Fish River, on the Plettenberg Bay side of the Fish River, a no-go area, and killed anybody, man, woman and child, that was living in that area. So a border was declared over a few frontier wars in Fish River, and life settled down to a reasonable degree in the Garden Route, during which time British settlers came out here, a big party in 1850, headed by one Major Harker, also a ex-British Army major. Sorry, no, I think he was a captain actually. Came out in the 1850s and brought with him a whole party of artisans, as did Newdigate in 1856, and they brought with them enough people to populate further the region now known as Bitu, and built some impressive houses, including Forest Hall in the other side of Kuruland. And so between 1850 and 1900, the area slowly filled up with British expatriates and their artisanal class of people, plumbers, roofing. There was even an apothecary, as what we would know as a chemist. And at the same time as they came out, so the Anglican Church came with them. And Newdigate was the first to build a little chapel on his farm, Redbourne, above the golf course, the country club golf course in the Brackenridge area. And then a little rectory and small chapel was built on the area of Hobie Beach, which was occupied until the later part of the 19th century, when the current St. Peter's Church was built with the architectural skills of Sophie Gray, the wife of Sir George Grey, who was the famous Cape Governor of the 1850s. And so the local population started advancing and developing to the point where plots were laid out in Plet Central, the modern-day town or business district, and they were occupied in the turn of the century around 1900. And the Beacon Isle, that had formerly been empty of humans, was first developed into a lodging house, and then very briefly as a whaling station in 1910, 1912. But the whaling station itself was, with the outbreak of World War I, was not viable. So it fell apart, and then it became lodgings first, and then in the 1940s rather, a small hotel was built, and that was later replaced by the modern Beacon Isle Hotel by Sun International under Sol Kerzner, and that opened in 1970. In the meantime, the former government of General Smuts had been replaced in 1948 by the National Party under D.F. Malan after World War II. And it was not long before the National Party government passed the Group Areas Act of 1950, I think it was, in which people of colour staying in amongst white folk in certain towns and cities were summarily evicted from their homes and sent to live in other less hospitable places. My knowledge is largely based on my experience of living in Cape Town and being witness to the destruction of District 6, Newlands Village, Harfield Village, the streets in Greenpoint, whose name escapes me, Tramway Road. All these little communities that had been formed over so many centuries were summarily evicted from their homes and sent out to the wastelands of the Cape Flats and left to make good there. Similarly, in Plettenberg Bay, the so-called coloured families of Plet, including some well-to-do folk who were descendants of Captain Harker, were evicted from the centre of town, and also from Pisang Valley, and also from Goose Valley, and sent to live without benefit of sanitation or water in what became New Horizons. Then one of the saving graces was that under the Iceland line, so-called coloured people were given preferential treatment in terms of jobs, and African people were forbidden to work under so-called Section 10 rights in the urban and suburban areas of the Western Cape, the Cape province as it was then known. But as is inevitably the case, economic attractions and the lack of opportunities in the Eastern Cape in particular sent people over the border of the Eastern, let's say over the Fish River, into the Western Cape, and they found a purchase here, not only in Plettenberg Bay, but along all the coastal resorts like Kentton-on-Sea and Hermanus and so forth, and Cape Town itself, found themselves a place, put up irregular settlements made of whatever bits and pieces they could find, the so-called informal or squatter camps. And Plettenberg Bay was no exception. And the municipality, perceiving that the black African people were not going to go away in a hurry, started working up a township, which became KwaNokuthula. But the informal settlements still stayed, settlements like Kolweni, Bossiesgif, Pine Tree, Gaitji, they all stayed and persevered against many attempts. And of course the other dimension of informal settlements is the perpetual fires that break out. So it was quite a tenuous existence. But with the coming of democracy, full democracy in 1990, some recognition was given to these folk, and some housing developments took place over time, particularly in KwaNokuthula, and services were laid on so that the conditions were less onerous than was the past. But I think from all these stories that we tell of these people and their different patterns of migration, even now we can talk about a cross-section of people in Bitu that come from Ethiopia, Somalia, Nigeria, all the other African states where economic or lack of economic opportunity and lack of peace and security, particularly in the East Africa, in the Horn of Africa, has sent people over here. Yeah, and Zimbabwe would be another example, Malawi. So there's lots of African countries south of the Sahara that have sent their citizens, young men and women here in hope, as we always like to say, of a better life. And it's not always been easy. There have been xenophobic responses to this mixture of immigrants. But if you look at the history of humanity, including my own ancestors, people have always moved throughout time from one place to another, migrated, as it were, not necessarily in a given decade, but over time, people have moved from one place to another, married one another, lived in harmony together over many decades and centuries until somebody comes along and provokes people into anger and wars break out, of which Rwanda would be the best example, and also Yugoslavia after Tito. So it's an uneasy peace at the best of times. And I think the other difficult feature of modern history in Bitu, if not in the whole of the world, is the rise of organized criminality and gangsterism, drug abuse, exploitation of women and children, and then met by a counterforce of safety and security people who try and keep the order, the peace, but like the Wild West in the United States, where law and order start disappearing and unscrupulous people take command of the situation. There's always this counterblast among folk trying to bring peace and order back. So it's a continual flux between war and peace, and it's something that interests me a lot as a former veteran of Angola. It's interesting to me how the whole history of Southern Africa has been characterized by the shedding of blood at one time or another, torture and mayhem, and that such times have been succeeded by periods of relative peace. But every one of us can claim some ancestor or some modern relative that was eyewitness to conflict, if not an outright victim of conflict. So for me, one of the challenges in Plettenberg Bay, which is relatively small in populations, but they're talking about 60,000 residents in total, it's sufficiently small to be capable of healing itself if sufficient quantity of people are able to grasp the difficulties that are presented by race, class, language identity, country of origin. Feelings are strong, especially when economic need is powerful. And I think that in as much as the poorest people require some kind of sustenance and are ready to do strange things in order to get something on the table, there are equally wealthy people on the other side of the divide who are fearful in the extreme of losing their privilege and their status and their wealth, and will work quite hard to undermine and destroy any attempt at changing what for them has been a comfortable place for a very long time. So for me, as a son of a white middle-class professional family, it's very hard to give up my status and attempt to understand and be part of something larger than my community. And I've also received a lot of hatred and attempted violence and theft and various forms of intimidation on my own person and those of my family because of my unrelenting pursuit of justice and democracy. And it's not easy being a liberal South African. I think the natural tendency is for people to expect you to be reactionary, to expect you to be racist, to expect you to stand for white middle-class solidarity and to refuse entry to anyone else. It's hard because I can see that these people are wrong. I can see that they have a lot of hatred towards me. They chastise me and swear at me in my face. And I suppose you can say my Judeo-Christian belief system forbids me to get angry in return and retaliate. So it's tricky. And I think by studying history and by looking at it together, looking at all sides of the conflict and trying to understand where different people were coming from and why they were motivated to do what they did, is to begin to understand each other and to try and reach out in some kind of, I don't talk reconciliation anymore. I only talk toenadering, which is to say that we can come a little bit closer than we have been and start to move closer towards a truly non-racial democracy. I think that's something I still strive for and I won't stop striving for. It's about as much as I want to say on the subject. I don't know if there's anything more to say. There's a lot of detail in what I've been speaking about. I'm happy to pick up on some of the detail and pursue it, but I feel as if my story has come to an end.